Think it's time for one last look back at the 2023 season before we move on to 2024. And I found this year that I haven't seen very many people do this, and I don't know if it was just because the races weren't all that great and they all blended together in everyone's mind, or if maybe these videos just aren't performing as well as they used to, but I figured I would rank all of the races in a tier list from 2023 to give one final send-off to a very tedious season for any non-Red Bull fan. So over the Christmas break, I went back and watched the highlight videos for all of the races from 2023 and tried to rank them all, which was incredibly difficult because so many of them were very similar. So switching over to the tier list, as usual, I have 5 categories. I have banger, great, dramatic for the wrong reasons, some good moments, and snooze fest. First up, we have Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi for me, very, very, very borderline, but I'm putting it in some good moments. The best part of Abu Dhabi was watching how the scoreboard changed as the various battles and overtakes happened to determine who would finish P2 in the constructors. That was the thing that made this race interesting. There was a couple moments on the first lap where Charles had a chance to get Max, but I think he was being a bit overly cautious to make sure that he didn't DNF and cost Ferrari the chance at P2, so he kind of let Max off the hook, and after that there was no battle for the lead, which was the case in a lot of races this year. And I think it was very interesting towards the end once Charles was trying to ensure that he gave Checo space to build a gap to Russell, but he just didn't quite play it right. So Ferrari ended up finishing P3 in the championship. But yeah, there was a few good overtakes here and there in that race and a few small moments of chaos, but I don't really recall much happening. And I think I said at the time there was a lot of overtakes in this race, but not very many battles, which I think battles are more exciting for me than overtakes. So I have that one in some good moments. Next up is Australia, and for me, this one is going in banger. I hummed and hawed about this one a lot, mainly because the start of the race was exciting, then you had Alex going off, the red flag, then you had a little bit more excitement, and then you had Magnussen's tire hitting the wall and his tire causing a red flag, and then you have the final chaos on the restart. But between all that, I could not tell you what happened in this race, which makes me putting in a banger kind of surprising. But for me, just a banger is one that no matter what, I'm always going to remember what happened in that race. And this race was just so chaotic that there was no way I wasn't putting it in banger. The chaos of that last restart was was wild, and no, we'll never forget that run. Next up is Austria, and Austria for me is going in great. Austria is one of those tracks that just lends itself to really good racing and really good battling, and there was a lot of that in this race. I did dock a lot of marks just because Max sped off into the distance as per usual. There were just a lot of really good battles happening in this race, and I think there was kind of 4 in together as a group at one point, which was quite exciting. And then, of course, there was the drama with all of the track limits issues, but that just caused a lot of drama, and so it was interesting to watch all the way through. Charles also did quite well in this race, which is always something that kind of bumps the track up for me, and so did Lando as well, which was exciting to see as McLaren had been really struggling up to that point in the season. So all in all, a decent race based on the other races of this year. Next up, I have Bahrain, and it is going just ahead of Abu Dhabi. I think Bahrain was very disappointing for me in the fact that Max just sped off into the distance, and it let us all know that we were in for a long season with very few different race winners. But it was also the race that we saw how good Fernando Alonso was going to be in that Aston Martin, and so that was something that brought a lot of excitement, especially some of his overtakes that he made on Carlos and Lewis. And Stroll really impressed us all in this race. We also had a lot of the chaos of the McLarens struggling so much at the back and Esteban getting his 3 penalties. And so I think there were a few good moments in this race, but I think it just wasn't super memorable for me, and the racing just wasn't quite there. I think there was too much of a gap between some of the teams at that point in the season. Next up is Baku, and sadly, for the second year in a row, it's going in snooze fest. Ugh, Baku is so tricky because it's so dependent on when the safety car comes out, because there's always a safety car, but this year it was right at the time when everyone could pit, and so it just meant that it removed all of the interest in terms of strategy from the race, and it was also just didn't cause any more chaos on the restart. There was a little bit of battle for the lead with Checo and Max and Charles briefly, but it just seems like the Red Bulls were able to speed off into the distance, and surprisingly, Checo was able to hang on for the win there. So yeah, just a bit of a boring one. Next up is Brazil, and Brazil was super, super, super tricky for me, because for the vast majority of that race, there was absolutely nothing happening. It felt like there were huge gaps between a lot of the drivers. A lot of the interest was gone because Charles crashed on that formation lap. And you had Daniel and Oscar kind of out of it, being a lap down due to the issues with their front wings from the start. And a lot of drivers crashed and a lot of drivers DNF'd. And so there just wasn't very much actual racing happening in this race, except for, I think, the best moment of racing all season between Fernando and Checo on that last lap. And for that reason, I have it in great. But at the very, very bottom end, I was almost considering adding another category between great and some good moments that is just like one great moment. But I think it deserves to be in great only because I will remember this race for that last lap on its own. And the first lap on its own, and the formation lap, because that was such a moment of pain for Charles fans. But yeah, so that one was very, very tricky for me to place. Next up is Canada, and for me, it's going between Bahrain and Abu Dhabi. Canada is another one that's a bit tricky because it was the first Grand Prix that I was able to attend in person, and for that reason, that made it much more memorable and much better than it probably actually was. George Russell crashed in this one, Lando had a few good overtakes, and I think Stroll managed to get Bottas over the line, which was quite exciting. The thing I'll remember most about this race was Alex Albon's performance, because he was able to lead a train of cars for so many laps in this race, and there was a huge gap between Checo and him, but he managed to finish behind Checo. Which was very wild. And so that this race will always be memorable for that. But yeah, just weren't that many really good moments in this one. I think Canada has kind of suffered with these bigger cars. I don't think there's enough good racing with them, because Canada was known for being a very good track back in the day, especially around like the 2011 to 2014 kind of era. Because I remember that was when Daniel won and Jenson Button's famous win. And I think there was just a lot more racing when the cars were smaller there. So hopefully if they break the car smaller again, the racing will improve. Next up is Circuit of the Americas, and it is going in great behind Austria. Coda always delivers, apart from a sprint race. But I think this was one of the only races of the year where Mercedes looked quite competitive. Lewis had a great race and was kind of let down by his Mercedes team in terms of strategy, but Max still ran away with this one. He did have to battle through quite a few cars, which made it much more interesting, but once he got that lead, there wasn't really any doubt. And yeah, Ferrari made mistakes with their strategy with Charles, and yeah, just a lot of good passing and stuff in this race as per usual. But like I said, all of these races are separated by a hair, and for me, I think Austria just stood out a little bit more in my mind. But there was a lot more consistent battles in it, so that's why I have it ahead of Brazil. Next up is Hungary. And Hungary was another snooze fest. The only excitement that happened in this race was off the start when Joe had an issue with his car on the start and then crashed into the back of Daniel, who sent an Alpine flying into the other Alpine. But other than that, there wasn't any other moments that happened during this race. Hungary is always a tough track to overtake on, and so there wasn't much of that happening either. And it was also one of the races where Max had his largest margins of victory. Yeah, just a nothing race. I couldn't really tell you much else of what happened in this one, so that's why it's going in a snooze fest. Just had a bit of an interlude there. We think our cat got sprayed by a skunk. Because there was this intense burning smell wafting around. Yeah, and his fur stinks, so I'm gonna be dealing with that for the next little bit, which is lovely. Anyways, next up is Suzuka, and I'm throwing Suzuka into great, just ahead of Coda. Japan was another one where Max flew off into the distance, but there was quite a good battle with Lando and Oscar in there. You had Checo being an absolute menace, taking out Magnussen and then DNFing and then un-DNFing himself. The Mercedes had quite a battle and a lot of good overtakes into turn one, so it was a great race. Next up I have Jeddah, and it is going behind Canada. Jeddah at least had a bit of a battle for the lead, in the sense that Max had to chase down Checo and managed to get decently close to him but wasn't able to get past him. So one of the few races this year Max didn't win, which automatically adds a little bit of interest to it. But I don't know, I guess 2022 Jeddah was decent with the battle between Max and Charles, but this year just wasn't the same level of intrigue, and with Charles having a 10th place grid drop, there wasn't much interest at the front in this one. And also not as much chaos as can sometimes be generated at Jeddah. Stroll did make a fantastic overtake on lap 1, though. That was one thing that I did remember about this race. Next up is Las Vegas, and it's going in the number 1 spot for me this year. I think some of you may disagree. It's a very close toss-up between this one and Singapore, which I will discuss later. But for me, I think Vegas was my race of the year. There was just a lot of great passes. It was one of the few races this year where Max actually had to battle for the lead, and Charles just did a fantastic job of holding him off and might have won if not for that late safety car. There was enough chaos in this one as well, and yeah, just overall a very good race and a good first outing at Vegas. I'm hoping that in future years it can be similar like this and it will become a mainstay on the calendar. I know a lot of Europeans don't love it, but I think it has a perfect mix of entertainment value and racing value. Now, Miami, on the other hand, we can get rid of that one, but Vegas, I think, should be here to stay. Next up is Mexico. And this might be a little controversial, but I have it in great, just ahead of Brazil. There wasn't much of a battle at the lead in this one, apart from that first lap clash between Charles and Checo, with Checo trying to go around the outside at turn 1. But for me, I loved this race just because Daniel did so well in it, and I was just constantly interested in what was happening with him. And then you had Lando, who just had a fantastic battle through from the back. And there was a little bit of interest with the middle of the race red flag caused by Magnussen's crash. So there was just enough happening in this one that I thought it was pretty good, especially for a Mexico GP. Usually it's one of the worst of the year because that track is just not good. And but this year it definitely proved me wrong. If I wasn't such a Daniel fan, though, it would probably be a little bit lower. And next up is Miami, and it's going in some good moments just ahead of Bahrain. Miami at the time, I think it was a bit of a snoozer, but kind of compared to all the other races this year, it wasn't too bad. And I think the thing that I remember most about it is Max battling through and him getting past Checo and that kind of being the moment where we all kind of knew that he was going to win the championship. And I think that's right after this race. I don't think it was as good. It's probably rated higher now than I would have at the time, but I think just in the context of the season, I think that race was a big statement by Max and a big moment in this race season, and I think that's why I have it a little bit higher here. And I also think it was very interesting watching Charles crash several times in qualifying and him just not really having much pace in the race, getting stuck behind Magnussen for a lot of the race. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting one looking back on it. And next up is Monaco, and I have Monaco at the top of great. This one was very close for me for going into banger. I think I would have put it in banger if Fernando Alonso had made the right decision and then won the race as a result. But I think this is as close to a banger race as you can probably get for Monaco. I don't really know what was missing for me. I think maybe just that kind of shock result. I think there was a lot of chaos happening in this, and it was kind of disappointing that nothing really came of it. Yeah, that's about as good of a race as you can get in Monaco for sure. All right, next up is Monza, and it is going right behind Monaco. I think Monza is one of those tracks where you're really rarely going to get a really good battle there. But what I think Monza does really well is the DRS is ineffective, making it very difficult to pass. And so it's always very tense every time going into turn one, where you don't know if one driver's going to make a mistake and allow the other driver past. But this year, there actually was a really good battle, and that was between Carlos and Charles on the last few laps, when Charles was desperate to get past for a podium position, and Carlos was just sticking his elbows right out, and they nearly took each other out several times. It is a miracle that neither of them ended up doing that, and I was screaming at my computer screen watching the end of this race, and for that, it makes it super memorable. But it's tough to get a banger at Monza unless there is a shock result. I think if Carlos had managed to hang on, or if they had actually taken each other out, I think that would have thrown it into banger. But they did not take each other out, and so it's only a great race because we can only have bangers when Ferrari suffers. Next up is Qatar, and some of you could have probably guessed, but this one is going into dramatic for the wrong reasons. Qatar itself actually was a decent race. I probably would have thrown it in great, but all of the drama with the tire stints being limited to 18 laps and the heat being so extreme that so many of the drivers were feeling really ill afterwards, and Logan had to retire from sickness, and Ocon threw up in his helmet at one point. Lance was passing out around some of the high-speed corners. And so it just wasn't a very good look for F1, and it brought a lot of concerns about driver safety in extreme conditions to light, which I think is kind of a good thing in a sense, that we got lucky that nothing happened in this one, and so they're able to take a look at it and make changes for the future so that it doesn't happen again. But we keep having these situations where something happens, and instead of being proactive about it, we're being reactive. And I would rather that F1 starts to be more proactive with driver safety, especially with this kind of issue, as well as with tractors on track. So that is the wrong reasons that it was dramatic. But other than that, I think there was quite a few interesting overtakes that happened. There was obviously that crash at the start between the Mercs, and George was able to battle his way through. Lando was also able to battle his way through a little bit after qualifying poorly, and Oscar managed to finish ahead of him for a P2, which is his best result in F1. So yeah, overall, it was a good race, but I have to knock it for all of those issues. Next up is Silverstone, and it's going just behind Austria. This one was great off the line. We actually had a battle for the lead, with Lando managing to get past Max. Near the end of the race, there was that late safety car, and Lando and Lewis had quite a good battle, but there wasn't as many battles throughout this race, and I think that's where it kind of lacked compared to Austria. But it was very exciting to see both McLarens end up on the podium after their struggles at the start of the season, and this was kind of I guess Austria was like the first race for Lando, but in terms of both of them having a turnaround for this season. But yeah, just a decent race, and there's always a good race around Britain, so I'm not surprised by that. Next up is Singapore, and it is going in second behind Vegas. Singapore was obviously the only race in 2023 that Red Bull did not win. Carlos managed to win, and it was primarily just due to some bad luck that finally went against Red Bull. Everything after that late safety car with the Mercs catching up to the back of Lando and Carlos brilliantly using Lando as a shield between himself and the Mercs, and Lando doing some fantastic defensive driving to keep ahead of George, and then of course George binning it on the last lap of the race. That ending was just so tense and so good, and this entire race was super tense because we just weren't 100% sure who was going to win, and that was the only time that I could say that last year. But I think it just lacked a little bit in terms of the battles that Vegas had. I think there are kind of two kinds of races that I think can be good. One of them is more like Vegas, where you have a lot of battles, you have a lot of lead changes, and so you don't really know who's going to win because of that. Or you have a more strategic kind of thinking man's race, like Singapore was for Carlos, where fantastic strategy and just biding your time and just things being really close the whole time, even if there's not much overtaking happening. It's just very tense, and you're just focused on whether or not any of these drivers are going to make a mistake, and that's what causes a good race. So that's kind of the Singapore Monza kind of races, or kind of generally seem to be that kind of race, whereas the Vegas, Silverstone, Austria are kind of more a lot of overtakes and that kind of exciting kind of race. And so I think those are the two kinds of races that can be exciting. And then, oh, of course, there's also the third kind of race, which is just a crash fest. You always want the drivers to be safe, obviously, but when they do happen and everyone's okay after, it does add an element to the races. So that was what Australia was. And yeah, it's just chaos, the chaos element. Next up is the Belgian GP, and it is going just ahead of Canada. This one was another one where Max just blew into the lead, although I think he had to make a few passes because if I remember correctly, he took an engine penalty, so it was starting from P6. Yeah, just after Max got into the lead, there wasn't much overtaking at the front. And then there was a few in the middle with Lando doing some overtakes through Sector 2, as well as Ocon having a really good race, I remember. And there was a little bit of rain, but it wasn't enough for there to be any pit stops as a result. So this was kind of just a race where we were close to a lot of interesting things happening, but nothing ever did. So it was kind of a bit disappointing in that respect, and I think that's kind of why I have it lower down. But yeah, I think everyone loved Spa, and it's fantastic to watch cars race there, but I don't really remember the last time there was a really, really good race in Spa. And so I think, honestly, I personally find it a little bit of an overrated track in terms of the entertainment value, but in terms of the racecraft and seeing what an F1 car can do, I think that's what makes Spa a good track. I think Spa is a track that suffered because of the DRS, because the straights are so long and it's so fast that it's just too easy to pass up the Kemmel Straight. And I think if they could somehow even remove the DRS effect or something, maybe not even use it on the straights in Spa, I wonder if that would maybe make things a little more interesting, because the slipstream effect is so strong there that it might make the racing a bit better. I don't know, just some food for thought. Next up is Spain, and I have Spain just ahead of Abu Dhabi. This is obviously the old track because it has the chicane in the final corner. But yeah, I have never found Spain to be an interesting track. I don't know what it is about it. It just doesn't generate good racing. I think it's definitely improved with the change to the last corner, but it's always been a much more strategic track, but in the sense that it's almost always a two-stop, and it's tough to really follow who is actually doing well in this race because people are always on different strategies at different points, and I think that just kind of takes away from the racing. There was a lot of good battles in the kind of lower midfield in this race, but I don't remember there being much happening in the top half of the field. And so I think that's why I have it so low. It's like when the only interest you're getting is for like P9 and P10, it's like, not a great race. And next up is Zandvoort, and it was my third favorite race of the year. I think Mother Nature gave us a fantastic wet race. I don't think we've had a wet race like this since probably one of my personal favorite races, Hockenheim 2019. It was a downpour at the start, which caused a bunch of drivers to pit to inters and some to hang it out. And then cars had to pit again, and somehow the ones who had not pit throughout the whole thing were still at about the same place. So both strategies were equally as good. The bad strategy was something like what Lando Norris did, where he pit on like lap 4 after he would have not gained any benefit from going on the inters. And then he suffered as a result of that. And then we also had the downpour at the end of the race when it was completely torrential and made the track undrivable. A couple drivers even going for the full wets, which is just not something that anyone does anymore because those tires are so bad. So please fix that, FIA. But yeah, just the fact that Max was able to stay in the lead throughout all that just proves how dominant Red Bull were this year. But I am very happy for Gasly, who managed to finish P3 in that race, and Alonso, who finished P2, kind of in the middle area of the season when they had kind of lost some performance. So yeah, that was quite exciting. So yeah, the last race on there is Imola, which obviously didn't happen this year. So that is my ranking of the 22 races from 2023. Yeah, it just, honestly, if I had taken these races in any other year, I think a lot more of them would be below the great level, but it just got to a point where everything became relative. And some of these races were better than others. Yeah, I think compared to other seasons, definitely not as good. I feel like even the bangers this year, I wouldn't necessarily have called bangers in past years, but I think for me, I would go back and watch all 4 of those that I rated bangers. So here's to hoping that 2024, we have more in that top category than we did this year. So that's the end of this one. Please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this content. I'm planning on trying to get 1 video out a week leading up to the 2024 season. We will see if I am able to manage that. I am preparing for an exam to write in May, and so that might take up some of my time, so we'll see. It's not that far away from the 2024 season, actually. Less than a couple months now, which is wild. The off season is always a lot quicker than you think, but also a lot longer than you would think. So yeah, we'll see what happens there. So thanks for tuning in, and see you guys in the next one.